Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you all tonight. My name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And tonight we're thrilled to be hosting the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. As we do on the third Thursday of most months, whenever they're in session, we're joined today, of course, by the illustrious Matt Borders and our presenter tonight, author historian Bob O'Connor. Thrilled to welcome you all here this evening. If you like what you hear, go ahead and press that like button and hit the share button. It's an easy, free way to support both our organizations. Let us know that you like stuff like this and tell your friends about it. And if you want to take your support one level further, consider becoming a member either of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine or the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable, or both. Why choose? So that's a great way to take your support to the next level. As we're going along tonight throughout the presentation, if you have any questions at all, please drop them in the comments and we'll get to them at the end of the program. So with all that said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Matt.
Well, John, thank you very much. And again, thank you to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine for hosting us here for this Zoom session. Especially in the times we live in, this just makes it all the easier to get out to the public, to get out to our members and have these events. So again, thank you very much. Now, I want to dive right into it so we don't waste any time. Our speaker this evening, as John said, is author and historian Bob O'Connor. Now, some of our longtime members may remember Bob. He was just telling me prior to coming live here that the last time he was in was about 2007, 2008, but we're very pleased to have him back to speak on one of his newer works, The Veil of Secrecy, which is looking at one of the lesser known Lincoln conspirators, Sarah Slater. So I'm very much looking forward to this. The Lincoln conspiracy and assassination is one of my favorite subtopics of the Civil War. So Bob, why don't we turn it over to you and dive right in?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. See if I can get this up and going here. Well, we're good so far. There we go.
It looks good on our end.
How about that? So I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be here by Zoom because as I was telling Matt and John, all I read about COVID is that you don't have to worry about it unless you're old, and I'm old. So it's really helpful for me to be able to do this by Zoom. So we'll get started right away. As Matt said, I'm Bob O'Connor. I'm a full-time author. I'm retired. I've been retired for almost 10 years. And all I do is write books. Pretty good life if that's what you like to do. And I do. My first published work was 1959 when I was in junior high school. As I told John and Matt, I grew up in Illinois. I wrote for the Illinois Junior Historical Society magazine. They had two magazines, one for adults and one for students, and I was published. And my article was about basketball. So one real historic on Civil War, but it was about basketball. I've had over 5,000 articles published in recent years, mostly since my first book, which was published in 2006. I believe that was what I spoke on the last time I was at your roundtable. It was a book about John Brown. It was called The Perfect Steel Trap, Harper's Ferry, 1859. That was my first book, and it's also the book that I've sold the most. It seems like everywhere I go, people are interested in John Brown, regardless of what my subject is that I'm speaking about that evening. So, and I have 23 books in print. I told Matt I can't even keep up with myself. It says 22 on here, and I actually have 23. I have that includes an audio book, 2 children's books, and 5 ebooks. I prefer to write historical fiction. You probably know John Fry at the library in Hagerstown. He's got his own room named after him. And he says, why do you spend so much time doing research and write fiction? I said, well, John, 95% of all books written are nonfiction, and 95% of all books purchased and read are fiction. So I like my books to be purchased and read and not just written. So I have most of my books are historical fiction. This one that we're talking about tonight is historical fiction, but very well researched. Why did I write this book? I like to write about significant characters in history in the Civil War that the average person has never heard of. Now, if I ask a show of hands, how many have never heard of this person? Most of the hands would go up because there's not a whole lot of people that know about this lady. That's why I like to write about these kind of characters. And a lot of my books have that same theme to them. I also like there to be a local connection. In this case, there was a local connection, and that's another reason why I wrote this book. So Mrs. Slater is one of those people. This is Sarah Antoinette Gilbert. That was her birth name. She was born in Middletown, Connecticut, January 12th, 1843. This is the only known photograph of her. Father was a high school French teacher in Middletown. Her mother was from Trinidad. She spoke French as her native language. Her grandmother was from Martinique and spoke French. So the family spoke French at home. This is a really important element of the story, the fact that she spoke French. She dreamed to become a French actress, and so she was always trying to be somebody that she wasn't. She was always giving people fake names and aliases, and she used her mother's maiden name a lot, Antoinette Renaud, because she thought that was pretty sexy name, and she used other names wherever she went. People asked her what her name was. Her parents were divorced. She lived with her brother Robert. In February of 1861, right before the war started, her mother invited her to visit her in New York City. At the time, Sarah was living in New Bern, North Carolina. So she went to visit her mother, and her mother was real mysterious and said that she had to come and that she had to do whatever her mother told her while she was there. Her mother was really mysterious. She took her by train up to Albany, New York, and wouldn't tell Sarah why they were there. They stayed in a hotel, and they got all dressed up, and she took her to the Gaiety Theater for a performance of Romeo and Juliet. Well, this was perfect for a girl that wanted to be an actress. How wonderful would it be to go see Romeo and Juliet? So she was very psyched when she found out, finally where they were going and what she was going to see. So as Kate Regnolds played Juliet, Sarah knew all the words, and so she mouthed the words as they were going through the performance, of pretending like she was on stage in her place. But that wasn't the best part. Romeo was played by the most famous actor of the day. He was considered the most handsome man in the country. And I'm sure some of you have already figured out who he was. She imagined that she was playing opposite of him. Romeo was played by John Wilkes Booth, one of the preeminent Shakespearean actors of the day. So as I said, she lived with her brother Robert. They boarded with a newspaper editor, J.L. Pennington of New Bern, North Carolina, and Robert actually worked at the publishing office, helping them. They printed things like books and stationery and posters and business cards and things like that the average printer would do. But he was also a newspaper editor, very influential in New Bern. So Mr. Pennington gifted Sarah 10 dance lessons. Now, those of you that are around my age, when you're around middle school, we had to go to dance lessons because we were getting ready to go to high school and we had to know how to dance. So this was an important part of my life when I was growing up, and it was an important part of Sarah's life. She'd never taken dance lessons. She was very excited. So the dance lessons were from Rowan's Dance and Waltzing Academy, operated by Mr. Pennigan's friend, Rowan Slater. So Sarah was the only lady there without a partner, so she became Mr. Slater's partner. And this is an advertisement that I found from the Rowan Slater Dance and Waltzing Academy, which is held in the ballroom of the main hotel in New Bern, North Carolina. Now, Sarah loved the dancing lessons. And Mr. Slater loved Sarah. And he proposed eventually. And on June 21st, 1861, right after the war started, she became Mrs. Rowan Slater. So there's where the name comes from. Mrs. Slater was Mrs. Rowan Slater. So while living in New Bern, North Carolina, she had purchased a mourning veil. Now, mourning veils, as you probably know, were used by women in the Civil War when their husbands died in battle. And they wore these for long periods of time. Sometimes the minimum was about a year, but some of them wore them for 2 or 3 years. So there were a lot of women during this time, the 4 years of the war, that were wearing mourning veils because they were in mourning. Well, she wasn't in mourning. She just wanted to be an actress and she wanted to be mysterious. So she hid her face so that no one could see her. And this again plays an important part in the story. She always wore that mourning veil in public. Her brother teased her about it, thought she was pretty crazy for doing this. But she had a purpose, and it plays right into the story. So this would be like you and I going into a bank 4 or 5 years ago and wearing our COVID mask. And they'd press a little button in the bank, and pretty soon the police would be there and we'd be arrested. But just like now, when you do that now, everybody else is wearing masks, so nobody worries about it. So she was in a time period where nobody thought it was unusual for her to be wearing a mourning veil. So there's what her mourning veil looked like. Now, I dare you to describe what she looked like, because you can't tell. None of her features come through. You can't tell what color her eyes are, what color her hair is, whether she has a large nose or a small nose, whether she has a round face or a square face or an elongated face. You can't tell. So when the war began, all of her 3 brothers enlisted in the Confederacy. Even though they were from Connecticut, they were all now living in the South, and they all joined the Confederate Army. Rowan's Dance Academy closed. There were no men to go to the dancing classes, so they couldn't have the dancing classes, so he closed the dancing class. And Rowan became a purchasing agent for the Confederate Army because he didn't want to go in the service. Life for Mrs. Slater, the aspiring actress, was not what she would hope that it might have been. She was pretty bummed out. So Robert and Eugene, 2 of her brothers, got into a lot of trouble in the Confederate Army because they tried to encourage other men to desert. Well, this wasn't very kosher with the command of the Confederate Army. It was only through the intervention of General Robert E. Lee that they were able to avoid prosecution and even be hanged or shot at a firing squad, which is what you got when you deserted. Eventually, in 1864, her husband, Rowan, enlisted in the 20th North Carolina Infantry. She never saw him again in her life. So now she's abandoned, bored, this exciting little girl who wanted to be a French actress down in now she's living in Salisbury, North Carolina, and she's pretty bummed out. So she moves to Richmond, Virginia. And along toward the end of 1864, she wanted to go visit her mother in New York City. Well, that wasn't something that you just did during the Civil War because you had to have a pass. You couldn't go from the South to the North without a pass. You needed an official pass. And in order to get the official pass, she had to get that from the Confederate government, which was close by because she already lived in Richmond. So she went to see a Confederate Secretary of War, James Seddon, to pick up her pass. She had filed the papers, and the papers had been approved, and they had been sent to James Seddon. So here's James Seddon that she went to visit. Well, he was pretty annoyed at Mrs. Slater's petition to pass to New York City because she had claimed that her only brother, remember she had three, her only brother had died in the service of the Confederates. When he checked this out and found out that not only had none of her brothers died in the service of the Confederacy, but that two of her brothers had tried to desert and get others in the regiment to desert also, he was pretty peeved. So he pretty much blackmailed Mrs. Slater. He said if she would deliver some important dispatch to Montreal, Canada, he would get her pass to visit her mother. Montreal was the headquarters of the Confederate Secret Service, and Seddon was trying to get information to them. Their office was in the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel in Montreal, Canada. He realized that a woman might be able to manipulate her way through the situations better than a man. And here comes her French language ability. He realized that if she spoke French, authorities in Canada would assume that she was a Canadian citizen and let her pass through. So there's the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel where the headquarters of the Confederate Secret Service was. So he figured if she would stop, that she could go to the French embassy and they would take her in and she would jail. To Mr. Seddon, she was the perfect courier. But what about Sarah? Well, she didn't have much choice, but she decided it might be a pretty neat opportunity. She could become an actress and she would be acting as if she were an official courier. So she would get a chance to practice her acting ability. And she would travel, have a little excitement, and this seemed to be good. This would get her out of the boredom that she was having in her normal life. So these were her two contacts in Montreal. Jacob Thompson was the head of Confederate service, and Brigadier General Edward Gray Lee from Shepherdstown, Virginia. There's my local connection. I live in Charlestown. Shepherdstown's in the same county. Jefferson County is about 10, 12 miles from Charlestown. There's my local connection. So who's General Edwin Gray Lee? He was a cousin of Robert E. Lee. Thompson was one of the men who was being considered as a conspirator in the Lincoln conspiracy trials. Also, his names are in a lot of the documents for the trials. As a courier, she traveled back and forth to Montreal on 3 different occasions, starting in February of 1865, right toward the end of the war. Along the way, she stayed one night at the Mary Surratt boarding house in Washington. There's Mary Surratt and her boarding house. By the way, it's still there today. While she was at the boarding house, she happened to run into a man in the parlor that she recognized. she ran into John Wilkes Booth. She told him that she had seen him in a play in Albany, New York, and that she very much admired him and that she wanted to be an actress. So he took her to Ford's Theater, which was only a few blocks from the boarding house. There's Ford's Theater, and there's John Wilkes Booth again. She also became good friends and confidant to Mary Surratt's handsome son, John Harrison Surratt Jr. You're certainly familiar with that name, guy who got away. She traveled on several occasions with John Surratt, including to Montreal, Canada. So just to give you a timeline, what was happening here, President Lincoln was shot on Good Friday, April 14th at Ford's Theater. The president died the next day on April 15th. John Wilkes Booth escaped, was captured and killed on April 26th in Northern Virginia. The conspirator trials began early May of 1865. And John Harrison Surratt Jr. fled, who was not captured till 1867. So that gives you kind of a timeline. So the government found Mrs. Slater and questioned her for 4 hours. The War Department in Washington on May the 2nd, 1865. The man who questioned her was James McPhail, who was a Maryland provost marshal, and came to the War Department and her. But he was so confused that he was unable to find anything incriminating about her. You see, most of the information he had came from people that didn't really know what they were talking about. So he was convinced that she had traveled to Canada with John Wilkes Booth. But she hadn't. The only time she ever traveled to John Wilkes Booth was on horseback from the Surratt boarding house, Ford's Theater, which is about 8 blocks, and back. That was it. That was the only time she traveled with John Wilkes Booth. He was convinced that she traveled with John Surratt to Richmond, which she hadn't. He never asked her if she traveled with John Surratt Canada, because he thought she went there with John Wilkes Booth. She hadn't traveled with John Surratt to Richmond. He was convinced that she brought 2 trunks from Richmond to Mary Surratt. He had gotten that information from Lewis Whiteman, who rented in Mary Surratt's boarding house, and he had unloaded 2 large trunks that Mary Surratt had in her carriage when she arrived at the Surratt boarding house. The investigator McPhail thought that she had brought those from Richmond. She hadn't. She was convinced that one of her aliases was Kate Thompson, but Kate Thompson was a completely different woman. He was convinced that she was an employee of the Confederate government. She wasn't an employee. She was a volunteer. She was running an errand. She wanted to receive a pass to visit her mother. That's why she was carrying the packages. He finally released her. Conspiracy trials began on May the 8th. I have all the transcripts of the conspiracy trials, so I know what every one of the witnesses said. They had stenographers at the trial that would take down in shorthand the information that the witnesses said. And then in the evening, they would just transcribe that information, and it was published the following day in the Washington newspaper. It's been published in a book by Ed Steers. Has all the transcripts in there. And it's very interesting to read a lot of information in there that you probably would never figure out by yourself. So those stenographers that you shorthand called phonography, you can imagine working all day in the court, taking down shorthand, going home, transcribing it at night, and then getting back up in the morning and doing it again. That must have been quite a task. As I said, they were published during the whole entire duration of the trial. The trials lasted from May the 8th to June 30th, 1865. And the executions were on July the 7th of the 4 conspirators that were executed, including Mary Surratt and Surratt. So Mrs. Slater's name was mentioned numerous times by several who testified. One of those that testified was one of the conspirators, George Oserat. In his confession, he said he had taken Mrs. Slater across the river in his rowboat. But what he didn't say was that neither of them had spoken and that she was wearing a veil. So even if they would have questioned him, which they didn't, they just read his confession, but they'd have questioned him, he wouldn't have been able to describe her. He wouldn't have been able to tell you anything about her, just that he got in her boat and got out at the other end of the other side of the river. Louis Whiteman, who was the government's main witness, and as I said, lived in the Mary Surratt's boarding house, testified about her, but they had never met. Sarah Slater stayed in his room one night at the Surratt boarding house. Mary Surratt had to move him out to accommodate her. She didn't have any room for her, so she took Louis Whiteman's room and moved her Louis in with one of the other guys that was there. John Houlihan also lived in the Mary Surratt boarding house, and he testified about her. But again, they'd never met. He saw her in the hallway. He couldn't describe her. She was wearing a veil. Justice Howell was a Confederate operative. He had actually traveled with with Mrs. Slater, on her first trip to Montreal, but he had also never seen her without a veil, even though he stayed in the same room with her and begged her to take her veil off for him to see her, but she wouldn't do it. So no one can describe what she looked like. That was really helpful. They all testified that she spoke French and broken English, but she made it a point not to say much. She actually spoke perfect English. She just spoke French to throw people off. Everything anyone knew about her would have been determined to have been hearsay in most trials. Of course, this was a military trial, and they accepted hearsay in the military trial of the conspirators. So they might have accepted some of this stuff, but most of the witnesses didn't know what they were talking about. The only two men who ever seen her face were John Surratt and John Wilkes Booth, and neither of them were there to testify. So when John Surratt was captured in 1867, he was also brought to trial. I also have the transcript of that trial. This trial was a civil trial. Conspirator trials were military tribunals. His jurors were his peers. Conspirators had 9 Union generals who were the judges. Not exactly fair, would you say? So her name came up again in the testimony in the trials of John Surratt. Mr. Whiteman testified about her again, but he didn't know what he was talking about. He never met her. Mr. McMillan also testified about her, though he'd never met her either. So neither one of them knew what they were talking about. So in John Surratt's civil trial resulted in a hung jury. The jury voted 8-4 to acquit him. The government tried to try him a second time, but failed. So he was set free. So here's his mother, who's hanged, and John, the son, who is much more involved with John Wilkes Booth than his mother ever was, he's set free. He went on the lecture circuit to explain what happened to him. And he claimed the whole time that had never been told anything about an assassination. He was conveniently not in Washington at the time. He was seen the day of the murder of Lincoln, of the shooting of Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. He was seen. It was reported by a whole bunch of witnesses of where he was that day, and he wasn't anywhere near Washington. So in mid-May 1865, Mrs. Slater disappeared. So did $649,000 in the bank account of the Confederate Secret Service in the Ontario Bank in Montreal, Canada. Coincidence? By the way, that $649,000 in 2021 was equivalent to about $1.3 million, which would take care of someone like me for quite a while, I would think. So here's what Weichman said about Mrs. Slater. The government did its best to find out who the woman was, but was unable to find her. Found her. And that's why I was able to write the book about it. Why was she never found? No one in her neighborhood had ever seen her with a veil over her face. Civil War was over. Nobody else was wearing veils. She would have stood out like a sore thumb if she would have worn a veil to the grocery store or walking her dog or around town. She never wore her veil. She had remarried, divorced Roman Slater, the bum who abandoned her. So nobody knew her as Mrs. Slater. If somebody would have come into the neighborhood and asked for a lady wearing a veil whose name was Mrs. Slater, nobody would have known who that was. She spoke fluent English, did not speak French at all because she did not know anyone who spoke French. So nobody would have understood her in her neighborhood. So she spoke English. So they were looking for a lady with a veil named Mrs. Slater who spoke French. They weren't going to ever find her that way. She was also too pretty to be suspected as a missing murder. So the book's is historical fiction, but about 95% true. I do a lot of research. I spent a lot of time tracking her down after she disappeared, find out what happened to her, the rest of her life, what she did, where she lived, all that. It's all in the book. It's told in first person. Mrs. Slater tells the story herself. All my novels are written that way. All my novels are written in first person by the person who the story is being told about. All the situations and all the characters are real and make up the dialogue. As I said, the conspirator trials testimony and the testimony from John Surratt's trials have all been published. I have copies of all of them. This is the book, The Veil of Secrecy, Mrs. Slater, The Missing Lincoln Conspirator. It's 234 pages. The retail price $18.95. Now, before I get to questions, I'd like to tell you about a couple other projects that I've been involved in. As I said, I like to write about situations and characters that are not much known in the Civil War. This is a gun. It's called the Virginia Pacificator. It's a 48-shot repeating rifle, patented in 1861 by a man from Stanton, Virginia, which was never manufactured. It has 8 barrels like a pistol. A pistol has 6 barrels. This has 8 barrels. They go around. The barrel is 30 inches and is made into a rifle. It's got 6 bullets in each chamber. and it can be fired 48 times without loading. Now, if one side had this gun and the other side had single shot muskets, who do you think would have won that battle? Do you think that would have made a difference in the war, maybe shortened the war, maybe even would have changed who won the war? Remember, this was invented by a man who lived in Staunton, Virginia. He was a Confederate, but it was never manufactured. Fascinating story. If I ask you show of hands, I'm sure a lot of you would know this name, Abner Doubleday. And if you're my age or around my age, you remember learning in school that Abner Doubleday invented one of our favorite sports, baseball. Well, guess what? The name of my book is The Civil War General Who Did Not Invent Baseball. Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball. He never said he invented baseball. He never mentioned baseball in his 63 diaries that he wrote in his lifetime, in his over 100 articles that he had published in newspapers. Never mentioned the word baseball once. So how did he get stuck with the label that he was the inventor of baseball? It's a fascinating story. A bunch of men got together in the early 1900s. Some of the names you'll recognize. Gentlemen with the last names of Spalding and Rawlings. They all were manufacturers of baseballs and baseball gloves and baseball bats. And they wanted this sport to have an American inventor. They went to great lengths to pin it on Abner Doubleday, who happened to live in Cooperstown. They said he invented it in 1838. Abner Doubleday never set foot in Cooperstown, New York in 1838 because he was at West Point. You had to check out if you left West Point. And he never checked out the entire year, so he didn't go to Cooperstown. I'm working on a prequel of my first book, Perfect Steel Trap, Harvard Series 1859. The prequel is the book that goes before Perfect Steel Trap, as opposed to a sequel, which is after. The prequel will be about each one of the raiders, what they were doing in their life, how they got tied up with John Brown, and how they got to Harper's Ferry to begin the raid on Harper's Ferry. I'm working on a book on Henry Elke. He's another one of those persons that nobody's ever heard of. But you may have seen him in a drawing, a pretty famous drawing, and you may wonder how in the world did he got in the drawing? He was an immigrant, lived in Washington. He was a Civil War photographer and painter of the rich and famous. In fact, over 100 of his paintings and photographs hang in buildings in Washington today. This is the drawing of the people that were in the room with Abraham Lincoln at the Peterson House the evening that he was fighting for his life after he was shot. Now, all these people in this room are famous cabinet members, famous members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then over in the corner, there's two men over there. The one with the blue arrows, Henry Elke, immigrant. The man behind him is his brother, another photographer. What in the world were they doing in that room? Well, I'm not going to tell you because you're going to have to read the book to find that out. I'm also working on a trial series. I don't actually read Civil War books because I don't want to take a phrase or something out of a Civil War book and have it end up in my book and have people think that I was plagiarizing. So I don't read Civil War books. I read mostly trial books. I started thinking There's a bunch of characters in the American Civil War that never went to trial. I thought, well, maybe I could write a trial book about some of these characters and have a trial and see what would happen if they'd actually gone to trial. So my series has 5 characters. Actually, one is not Civil War related, but I think you'd be fascinated by who he is. The first one is the trial of John Wilkes Booth. When I told the bookstore, one of my bookstores, that this was available, on the phone, the one bookstore said, "Is this fiction or nonfiction?" I thought that was a pretty dumb question. So the trial of John Wilkes Booth. So because I'm having the trial and it's fiction, you say, well, you made all this up. But yeah, but I can take the witnesses and I know what the witnesses said in their lifetime. And so I can put that information in their mouth and have the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney ask them questions and get them to tell me what they said in their lifetime. So I'm able to have anybody as a witness or anybody as an attorney. So my defense attorney is a man they called the defense attorney for the damned. Well, that's a good description. John Wilkes Booth's pretty much a damned person. So my defense attorney is Clarence Darrow. My prosecuting attorney is someone that you've heard of too, but you may have not known that he was an attorney. His name was Francis Scott Key. Kind of have some Frederick roots there. So Francis Scott Key was an attorney. What's interesting about Francis Scott Key is that John Wilkes Booth plea is not guilty by reason of insanity. What you may not know is that Francis Scott Key's son was killed in Washington by a man who used the plea not guilty by reason of insanity to get off. He killed Philip Key in broad daylight on a street in Washington in front of many witnesses, and he got off scot-free because he claimed not guilty by reason of insanity. Another one of my interesting witnesses in this trial is William Shakespeare. How about that? My second book, which will be coming out this year, is called The Trial of Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis never went to trial. He was incarcerated for over 2 years. His attorney was a man that you may have never heard of. I've heard of him my whole life. The man's name, who was his attorney, is Charles O'Connor. My father's was Charles O'Connor. So I'm pretty familiar with that name. But this Charles O'Connor only had one N. So every time I typed his name in writing this book, I had to spell my last name wrong. His name is Oconor. And what's interesting was he was a Union man, and he worked for Jefferson Davis for free because he didn't think Jefferson Davis was getting a fair deal. He thought he was, as a U.S. citizen, was supposed to get a speedy and fair trial. He never got either one. The Trial of Jefferson Davis. The third book is The Trial of Nathan Bedford Forrest. You probably heard of him. Recently, his body was dug up in a park in Memphis, and the statue was taken down. He was a pretty influential and important Confederate general. Why did he go to trial, or why should he have gone to trial? Because of a little incident that happened at Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River, in which his men killed United States colored troops who had put down their guns and surrendered and held their hands up. Some of these men were nailed inside a building, and they set the building on fire, and these men were still alive when they burned them to death. They also buried some of them in a large grave while they were still alive. That's why he was being brought to trial. The fourth book is the trial of Colonel Dixon Miles. If you're familiar with the Battle of Harper's Ferry, there was a little incident there right before the Battle of Antietam where 12,419 Union soldiers were surrendered by Colonel Dixon Miles. People said that he should have been court-martialed, but he couldn't have been because he was mortally wounded right before the surrender and died the next morning. He never went to trial. It's an interesting story when you read about the fact that many of Dixon Miles' soldiers that were defending Harper's Ferry were never trained. Some of them were cavalry that didn't have horses. Some of them didn't have guns. They were sent there to guard the railroad, and they got attacked by Stonewall Jackson and some of the most experienced Confederate soldiers in the Confederate Army. And he was left, and Dixon Miles was left out to dry. General McClellan, where was he? Over in Frederick, reading the lost orders, which he never even told Dixon Miles he had. He was less than a day's march away, and he never made it to go over to help Dixon Miles. So that's the trial of Dixon Miles. The fifth book is not Civil War related whatsoever, but might be something that you might be quite familiar with. The trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. He never went to trial either. And boy, when you read this book, when you read about all the shenanigans that went on with the Houston police and the FBI and everybody, this is an amazing story. Lee Harvey Oswald never went to trial. Lost Evidence, a movie that was shown with the cells out of sequence, so you couldn't see that the car was slowed down or stopped when the bullet was fired. All kinds of shenanigans. Do you know that the Houston police interrogated Lee Harvey Oswald for over 18 hours? Never had a stenographer present and never had a tape recorder going, so they can't tell you what they asked him, and they can't tell you what he told them. Pretty amazing. So for those watching tonight, if you go to my website, www.boboconnorbooks.com, and you purchase any or all of my 23 books, I'll refund you $5 for each and every book you purchase. Now, when you go on the website, it's not going to show this special because it's only for the people that are watching. So anybody else, they don't get the $5 discount. So make sure that you mention that if you want to buy the books. As I said, it won't show up, but I will refund you the money in a check when I ship you the books. So it's been my pleasure to speak, and I'll be happy to answer any or all of your questions that you have. And thank you very much, Matt and John, for making this all happen. Let me get out of this.
Well, thank you, Bob. It was an excellent presentation and discussion on Sarah Slater, and I appreciate the previews as well for your upcoming work. That was an interesting treat that I wasn't expecting. John, are there any questions or anything that have come up via the computer? If not, I can also ask a couple that I have.
Yes. Ken asked, where did Sarah Slater end up, and how did you end up finding her?
Well, I ended up finding her through about 15 different sources. A lot of the information that got me on the right track came from a newsletter that's put out by the Surratt House. They've had a newsletter for years and years and years, and every once in a while there would be an article that I would pick up a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of something else. She actually was married 3 times, and she was a school teacher, and she had various jobs, and that's all. I've covered all of that in the book.
Don't want to give it all away. I understand that.
Good question. Now you have to read the book to find that
out. John also asked, a different John than me, asked if you came across any connections between Sarah Slater and Old Anacostia / Uniontown in Washington, D.C.
I didn't. Not that I recall. No, I didn't. Does he know of some?
I think that's just an area of interest for him in particular, and was wondering if there might be any crossover.
I don't know where. What did he say it was? Uniontown?
Uniontown / Old Anacostia. Anyway, that's all we got from the comments at this time. If anyone has any questions between now and when we wrap up, please drop them in there.
I usually see other pictures of people. It looks like there's only 3 of us. How many are out there?
There's around 20 or so that are tuned in.
Okay.
Well, that's great. Bob, I did have a question as well. You had been speaking on Rowan Slater and mentioned that he enlisted in the 20th North Carolina in 1864, and that he kind of disappears into the records, if you will. You implied later on, though, that he abandoned Sarah. Were you able to find anything out about him and what happened to him?
She said that she never heard from him.
Okay.
So I never tracked him. I never went into the Confederate records and tried to find out what happened to him, because I was following her.
Sure.
And she says that he never saw him again. She never heard from him. So she divorced him for abandonment.
Sure. Okay.
I mean, that didn't mean that he totally disappeared from the world and the universe. He disappeared from her life, and I was tracking her.
Right. Awesome. Excellent. The only other question I had actually was also related to kind of the periphery around Sarah. Robert and Eugene really dodged a literal bullet there, apparently, during their service. Do you know if they wind up making it through the war or not?
I didn't track them. I
was just curious.
Yeah.
No worries. Very good. Well, John, unless we've got anything else, again, it's been a pleasure having you, Bob. We are very careful, let me put it that way, in regards to presenters, especially presenters who are doing something of historical fiction. But you have a long repertoire of both historical work and historic fiction. You've worked with us before, and you came highly recommended by some of our favorite people around the roundtable. So it's a pleasure to have you back, sir, and thank you again for the presentation.
I appreciate that. When I research, I footnote as I write.
Fantastic.
And so I was actually asked about something in my Harper's Ferry book today, and I was, just before I came on with you, I was going through the last copy that I print has all my footnotes, and then I take them all out. Mm-hmm. And so I'm able to go back and tell the person that asked the question today what my source was for the comment that I made in 2006, which I obviously would not remember because I'm old and because the memory is the first thing to go. But I'm very careful with my research. I'm the only one that does my research. I know some of the authors have gotten in trouble with having people do research for them because, as you know, when you see a name like John Smith and you say, oh yeah, that's the guy I'm looking for. Well, there's probably a couple of John Smiths out there you have to really be careful of. And a intern or something would just grab that and say that's who you're looking for. And, so I do all my research myself. So I'm pretty sure that it's authentic. And one of my recent books, I actually wrote a book about the Confederate division that was at the Daniel Lee Farm in Gettysburg. And actually, the last third of the book, I actually went through each person's name in the book, and I tell you what happened to them after the war, after they were at Gettysburg. Oh, wow. And I actually footnote that part. So it's actually 2/3 fiction and 1/3 nonfiction. So nice. I'm starting to do that a little more to show you that I do know what I'm talking about, and that these people actually were, even though it's historical fiction, these people were actually camped on the Daniel Lee Farm, and they were wounded at Gettysburg, and that was the hospital. So I put them in the hospital. So you could say, well, you don't know for sure that they were in the hospital. I can say, yeah, but that was the closest hospital to where they camped. So I can assume that. But it's fiction, so I can't say for sure that they were there. But then I can tell you that they actually were in that regiment. Couldn't know what happened to them after they left. They were either, many of them were POWs because they were the enemy, and it was Union City. And some of the doctors, for instance, stayed there to take care of the wounded and were let go and weren't captured. But I actually am kind of combining the fact that I have all the footnotes. I actually combined it in that book, and it was kind of interesting how that turned out. But I appreciate that Civil War roundtables don't always like to have somebody with that writes historical fiction, but I'm real careful with what I say and do. I appreciate it.
Well, we do appreciate a good story, though, especially one that can be backed up and cited. So thank you very much, sir. I just want to say real quick before we sign off here, John, next month we will be having Dennis Durbeck, who will be speaking on his artillery collection. And if we're able to actually get him in the museum, which is the intention, he's going to have some items for you guys to actually get your hands on and get a real up close and personal view of his artillery collection. So that should be a really interesting kind of presentation, and a little bit of hands-on with that too. So again, Bob, thank you for joining us this evening. Unless there was anything else, John, have a great night as well. And we look forward to seeing you all next month on February 17th.
Splendid.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, John.